The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Belmont Heights, where million-dollar homes stood like monuments to success. Richard Coleman's Mediterranean-style mansion dominated the corner lot, its terracotta tiles gleaming under the California sky. At 62, Richard had built an empire from nothing: real estate ventures, tech investments, and a chain of luxury hotels that stretched from San Diego to San Francisco. Inside the grand foyer, Michael Coleman adjusted his tie, preparing for another day at Coleman Industries, where he served as vice president of operations. At 34, Michael possessed his father's sharp jawline and penetrating blue eyes. But where Richard exuded confidence, Michael carried an undercurrent of restlessness. "You're running late," Richard observed, descending the marble staircase. With characteristic precision, his silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit impeccable. Even at home, he maintained the bearing of a man who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals. "Traffic on the 405, Michael replied, though he'd actually spent 20 minutes staring at himself in the bathroom mirror, wondering when he'd become a stranger in his own reflection. Their relationship had always been complex, a delicate dance of professional respect masking personal distance. Richard had raised Michael alone after his mother's death when he was 12, channeling his grief into building the business that would secure their future. But in doing so, he'd erected walls that neither man seemed capable of scaling. "The Henderson project needs your attention today," Richard continued, pouring coffee from an expensive espresso machine. "They're getting nervous about the timeline." Michael nodded, accepting the routine. Work was their common language, the safe territory where they could interact without venturing into the emotional minefield of their personal lives. In the office, Michael was competent, reliable, the son any father would be proud of. But here, in the cavernous silence of their shared home, he felt like an actor playing a role he'd never auditioned for. The kitchen was a showcase of granite countertops and stainless steel appliances designed more for entertaining than intimate family meals. They rarely entertained. Richard's social life remained largely mysterious to Michael, consisting of business dinners and charity galas, where Michael occasionally accompanied him as the dutiful heir apparent. "I'll handle Henderson," Michael said, checking his watch. "Are you still planning to review the quarterly projections tonight?" "Probably not. I have other commitments." There it was again, that vague reference to other commitments that had become increasingly frequent over the past 2 years. Michael had learned not to probe, understanding that his father's privacy was sacred territory. But the curiosity gnawed at him, creating a low-grade irritation that he couldn't quite shake. As they drove separately to the office in their matching black BMWs, Michael found himself studying his father's profile in the rearview mirror. Richard looked younger, lately more animated. There was something different about him, a lightness that Michael couldn't remember seeing since before his mother's death. The Coleman Industries building rose 32 stories above downtown Los Angeles, a glass and steel monument to Richard's vision. Inside, employees greeted both men with the deference reserved for those who signed paychecks. Michael moved through his day mechanically, attending meetings, reviewing contracts, making decisions that would have excited him once but now felt routine. But even as he performed his duties, a nagging sensation persisted, the feeling that he was living in the shadow of something he couldn't see or understand. His father's increasing absences, the mysterious phone calls taken behind closed doors, the subtle changes in routine that suggested a life Michael wasn't privy to. That evening, as Michael sat alone in the mansion's dining room eating takeout, Thai food, he listened to the silence that had become their constant companion. Somewhere in the house, Richard was locked in his study, conducting what he called private business. The walls between them felt higher than ever, built from years of polite conversation and careful boundaries. Michael had everything a son could want: wealth, opportunity, a clear path to inheriting one of California's most successful privately held companies. Yet sitting in that opulent room, surrounded by his father's achievements, he felt like a guest in his own life, waiting for an invitation that might never come. The opportunity came 3 weeks later when Richard left for what he described as a business retreat in Napa Valley. Michael had offered to join him, but his father had been unusually firm in his refusal, claiming he needed time for strategic planning that required complete solitude. Alone in the mansion for the first time in months, Michael found himself drawn to his father's study, a mahogany-paneled sanctuary that had always been off-limits during his childhood. The heavy wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing walls lined with legal texts, business journals, and family photographs that seemed to mock the distance between them. Richard's massive desk dominated the room, its surface meticulously organized with the precision of a man who controlled every detail of his environment. Michael ran his fingers along the leather-bound appointment book, noting meetings with names he didn't recognize and dates that corresponded with his father's mysterious absences. The locked filing cabinet in the corner had always intrigued him. As a child, he'd imagined it contained treasures, perhaps letters from his mother or photographs from Richard's youth. Now, driven by a curiosity that had fermented into near desperation, Michael searched for the key he remembered seeing his father hide years ago. He found it taped beneath the center desk drawer, exactly where his 12-year-old self had watched Richard place it after his mother's funeral. The filing cabinet opened with a soft click, revealing folders arranged with the same obsessive organization that characterized everything in Richard's life. Most contained predictable business documents, contracts, financial statements, correspondence with attorneys. But the bottom drawer held something different. A folder marked Personal Estate Planning that made Michael's hands tremble as he lifted it free. The will was dated just 6 months ago, replacing one that Michael had never known existed. As he read through the legal language, his world tilted on its axis. The bulk of Richard's fortune, the company, the mansion, the investment portfolio worth nearly $50 million, would not pass to his son. Instead, the primary beneficiary was listed as Elena Vasquez, described as my beloved companion and life partner. Michael stared at the name, reading it again and again as if repetition might change its meaning. Below her name was an address in Santa Monica and a notation indicating she was 38 years old, 4 years younger than Michael himself. The documents revealed a meticulous plan. Elena would inherit controlling interest in Coleman Industries, the family home, and access to accounts Michael didn't even know existed. Michael himself was relegated to a modest trust fund, enough to live comfortably, but nothing approaching the empire he'd assumed would one day be his. Additional papers revealed the scope of Richard's deception. Bank statements showed regular transfers to Elena's account dating back 3 years. Property records indicated Richard had purchased a condominium in her name. Insurance policies listed her as beneficiary. There were photographs, Richard and a stunning Latina woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes, laughing together at restaurants Michael had never seen. The betrayal cut deeper than the financial loss. Every conversation about the future of Coleman Industries, every mention of Michael's eventual leadership role, every discussion about carrying on the family legacy, all of it had been lies. While Michael had shaped his entire adult life around inheriting his father's empire, Richard had been systematically dismantling that future and gifting it to a woman whose existence had been completely hidden. Michael replaced the documents, exactly as he'd found them, his hands moving automatically while his mind reeled. The study looked the same, but everything had changed. The family photographs now seemed like props in an elaborate performance. The business awards and civic honors that had always made him proud of his father now felt like evidence of a man capable of breathtaking deception. As he locked the filing cabinet and returned the key to its hiding place, one thought crystallized with terrible clarity. His entire life had been built on a foundation of lies, and the man he'd spent 34 years trying to please had already chosen his replacement. Elena Vasquez had entered Richard Coleman's life during a charity gala 3 years earlier, though their connection had roots that stretched back much further into the shadows of his carefully constructed existence. She worked as a cultural liaison for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, organizing events that brought together the city's elite philanthropists and the artists they claimed to support. At 38, Elena possessed the kind of understated elegance that Richard had always found irresistible, intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see through pretense, a musical laugh that emerged without calculation, and a way of listening that made even the most powerful men feel truly heard. Unlike the society women who typically orbited Richard's world, Elena had built her own career, spoke 3 languages fluently, and could discuss everything from pre-Columbian art to emerging market economics with equal sophistication. Their first conversation had lasted 3 hours, long after the other gala attendees had departed. Richard found himself revealing thoughts he'd kept locked away for decades. His loneliness since his wife's death, his concerns about Michael's apparent lack of passion for the business, his fear that success had isolated him from genuine human connection. Elena had listened without judgment, asking questions that demonstrated both intelligence and empathy. What began as dinner meetings to discuss museum fundraising had evolved into something Richard hadn't experienced since his 20s, the intoxicating vulnerability of being truly known by another person. Elena didn't want his money or his status. She had her own career, her own apartment, her own life that she'd built without assistance. What she offered was something infinitely more valuable, the possibility of authentic intimacy in a world where Richard had grown accustomed to performing roles rather than expressing truth. The secrecy had been Elena's idea initially. She understood the complications that would arise if their relationship became public. The assumptions about her motives, the impact on Michael, the inevitable gossip that would reduce their connection to a tired cliché about older men and younger women. "Let us have this time," she'd said during one of their early conversations. "Let it be ours before it becomes everyone else's story to tell." Richard had gratefully accepted the privacy she offered. His Santa Monica condominium became their sanctuary, a place where he could shed the armor of authority and simply exist as a man in love. They cooked together, traveled discreetly to places where they were unlikely to encounter his business associates, and built a life parallel to but separate from his public existence. The depth of Richard's transformation surprised even him. With Elena, he rediscovered capacities for playfulness and spontaneity that had been buried under years of responsibility. She challenged his assumptions, introduced him to art and literature that expanded his perspective, and created space for conversations about philosophy and meaning that went far beyond the transactional relationships that dominated his professional world. But the secrecy came at a cost. Every family dinner with Michael became a performance of normalcy. Every charity event where Elena might be present required careful choreography to maintain their public distance. Richard found himself living a double life, presenting one version of himself to his son and the business community, while nurturing his authentic self only in private moments with Elena. The decision to restructure his will had emerged from long conversations about legacy and love. Elena had initially resisted, arguing that his obligation was to Michael regardless of their relationship. But Richard had countered that his obligation was to honesty, and the honest truth was that Michael had never shown genuine interest in the business beyond its financial rewards. Elena, by contrast, understood the creative and cultural impact Coleman Industries could have beyond mere profit generation. The company's real estate holdings included several properties with historical significance that Elena believed could be transformed into cultural centers. Her vision for integrating arts programming with urban development excited Richard in ways the quarterly profit reports never had. In Elena, he saw not just a life partner, but a kindred spirit who could carry forward his legacy in directions he'd never imagined possible. Yet even as Richard planned this future, he remained tormented by his inability to bridge the emotional distance with Michael. Every attempt at deeper conversation seemed to encounter the same invisible barriers they'd constructed over years of careful politeness. Richard knew he was failing his son, but he no longer knew how to reach across the chasm that grief and habit had created between them. In the weeks following his discovery, Michael's world contracted into a poisonous loop of memory and rage. Every childhood recollection now carried new weight, each moment of paternal distance recontextualized as evidence of a deeper betrayal. He found himself replaying conversations from years past, searching for clues he'd missed, signs of the deception that had apparently been unfolding around him all along. The memories came in waves, unbidden and brutal. He remembered being 12 years old, desperate for his father's attention after his mother's funeral, only to be told that Richard needed to focus on business to secure their future. How many nights had Michael eaten dinner alone while his father worked late at the office, or so he'd claimed? How many school events had Richard missed, citing urgent meetings that Michael now suspected had been romantic rendezvous with Elena? The pattern became sickeningly clear. Richard's increasing absences over the past 3 years, his mysterious good moods, his sudden interest in cultural events and charity galas, all of it aligned perfectly with the timeline revealed in those hidden documents. While Michael had been dutifully learning the business, preparing to carry on the family legacy, his father had been falling in love with someone else and systematically writing him out of the future they'd supposedly been building. Together, sleep became elusive. Michael would lie awake in his childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling and remembering every slight, every moment when he'd felt like an afterthought in his father's life. The Christmas mornings when Richard had been present but distant, checking his phone during gift exchanges, the graduation ceremonies where Richard had applauded politely but left immediately afterward, the business trips where Michael had begged to come along, only to be told he wasn't ready for such responsibilities. Now he understood. Richard hadn't been protecting him or preparing him. He'd been gradually easing him out of the picture, making room for Elena to step into the role of primary heir and companion. The rage that consumed Michael was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It wasn't the hot anger of a moment, but a cold, calculating fury that seemed to reorganize his entire nervous system. He found himself studying his father during their daily interactions, noting every gesture and expression, searching for signs of the man who could orchestrate such an elaborate deception while maintaining the facade of caring parent. Their dinner conversations became exercises in barely controlled violence. Michael would sit across from Richard, making appropriate responses to questions about work, while fantasizing about exposing the truth, about watching his father's composure crumble when confronted with his own betrayal. But he remained silent, gathering information, planning his next move with the strategic patience Richard had unknowingly taught him. The business meetings were torture. Richard would discuss 5-year plans and succession strategies, as if Michael's future leadership remained certain, all while knowing he'd already bequeathed control to his secret lover. Michael began to see his father as a master manipulator, someone capable of breathtaking duplicity disguised as paternal wisdom. Elena's existence became an obsession. Michael found himself researching her online, studying photographs from museum events, reading articles about her work. She was beautiful, accomplished, intelligent, everything he might have respected in different circumstances, but she represented something more sinister. Proof that his father was capable of forming deep, meaningful relationships, just not with his own son. The most painful realization was that Richard had found happiness, genuine, transformative happiness, with someone who wasn't Michael. All those years of emotional distance, all the excuses about being too busy or too focused on work, had been lies. Richard wasn't incapable of intimacy. He simply hadn't chosen to share it with his son. Michael's resentment crystallized into something harder and more dangerous, a sense that he'd been cheated not just of money but of love itself. The father he'd spent decades trying to please had been saving his authentic self for someone else, leaving Michael with scraps of attention and hollow promises about a future that had never been real. The transformation in their household dynamic was subtle but unmistakable. Michael began orchestrating conversations like chess matches, each dinner becoming a careful campaign of probing questions designed to expose the depth of his father's deception without revealing his own knowledge. He developed an almost scientific approach to detecting lies, cataloging Richard's tells and studying the mechanics of his father's elaborate performance. "You seem different lately, Dad," Michael observed one evening, cutting into his steak with deliberate precision. "More energetic." Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Barely a heartbeat's hesitation, but Michael caught it. "Just feeling good about the business. The Henderson project is exceeding projections." "That's not what I mean." Michael kept his voice level, conversational. "You seem happier, more fulfilled, like something has changed in your personal life." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Richard reached for his wine glass, another tell Michael had learned to recognize. "I've been doing some reflecting lately, thinking about what's important." "And what have you concluded?" "That life is shorter than we think, that it's important to pursue the things that bring joy." The euphemisms were maddening. Michael wanted to sweep the carefully arranged place settings off the table, to scream that he knew about Elena, about the will, about the systematic dismantling of everything he'd believed about their relationship. Instead, he smiled and nodded, playing his assigned role in this grotesque theater of family intimacy. "I've been thinking about that too," Michael said. "About legacy. About what we leave behind." Richard's eyes sharpened, perhaps sensing danger in the turn of conversation. "What do you mean?" "Well, Coleman Industries has been our family's whole identity for so long. I just wonder, what happens to all of this when you're gone? Have you thought about that?" "Of course I have." Richard's voice carried a defensive edge. "But that's not something we need to worry about for many years. But you have made plans? Legal arrangements? Michael, why are we talking about this?" "Because I'm 34 years old, Dad. Because I've spent my entire adult life working toward taking over this company, and sometimes I wonder if that's actually what you want." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Richard set down his wine glass with the careful control of a man defusing a bomb. "You are my son, my only child. Of course I want you to carry on what we've built." But Michael heard the past tense in "my only child" and wondered if Richard was already thinking of Elena as family in ways that excluded him. The phrase felt like another small betrayal, another reminder that he was becoming peripheral to his father's emotional landscape. "Then why do I feel like I'm being kept at arm's length? Why do I feel like there are parts of your life I'm not allowed to know about?" "Every person deserves privacy, Michael, even from family. Privacy, yes, but secrets? Secrets feel different." Richard's composure never cracked, but Michael could see the calculation behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of how much his son might know, how much danger this conversation represented. It was the look of a businessman evaluating a hostile takeover attempt. "I don't know what you think you're implying," Richard said finally. "I'm not implying anything. I'm just saying that lately, you seem like you're living a life I don't recognize. Like you've become someone I don't know." They finished dinner in silence, the weight of unspoken accusations crushing any possibility of normal conversation. Michael watched his father's face, noting every micro-expression, every careful gesture. Richard had become a stranger, performing the role of father, and Michael was beginning to understand that perhaps he'd always been. Later that night, Michael heard his father on the phone in the study, speaking in low, affectionate tones that he'd never used with his son. The words were indistinct, but the tenderness was unmistakable. Michael stood in the hallway, listening to proof of his father's capacity for warmth, knowing that warmth was reserved for someone else. The next morning they returned to their routine of polite small talk and business discussions, but something fundamental had shifted. Michael now knew that Richard was aware of his suspicions, and Richard knew that his carefully maintained facade was beginning to crumble. They moved around each other with the wary politeness of enemies pretending to be family, each waiting for the other to make the first decisive move. The confrontation Michael had been building toward finally materialized on a fog-shrouded Thursday evening in Santa Monica. He'd spent weeks learning Richard's patterns, noting the days when his father claimed to be working late but his office remained dark. Following him required patience and careful timing, but Michael had inherited his father's strategic mind along with his devastating capacity for obsession. Richard's BMW disappeared into the underground garage of a sleek condominium complex 6 blocks from the beach. Michael waited in his own car, watching through the building's glass lobby until he spotted them together, his father and the woman from the photographs, Elena Vasquez, more striking in person than any image had conveyed. They moved together, with the easy intimacy of long-established lovers, Richard's hand resting naturally on the small of her back as they entered the elevator. Michael waited another hour before approaching the building. The doorman was easily charmed with a story about surprising his father for his birthday, and soon Michael found himself standing outside apartment 4B, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that surprised him. Elena answered the door alone, wearing a silk robe that suggested Richard was somewhere nearby, probably in the shower. Her beauty was even more intimidating up close. Intelligent dark eyes, perfect bone structure, the kind of natural elegance that couldn't be purchased or faked. For a moment, Michael understood why his father had been willing to risk everything. "You must be Michael," she said, her voice carrying only mild surprise. "I wondered when this would happen." "So you know who I am." "Of course I know who you are. Richard talks about you constantly." She stepped aside, gesturing him into a living room that was tastefully appointed but unmistakably his father's second home. Family photographs that Michael recognized from the mansion sat on the mantelpiece alongside pictures of Richard and Elena together. "Does he? Because I'm just learning that you exist." Elena settled into an armchair with the composure of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "The secrecy wasn't my preference, Michael, but your father believed it was. Necessary to protect everyone involved. Protect everyone, or protect his ability to rewrite his will without interference." Her composure flickered. "You know about that. I know about everything. The money, the company, the systematic way he's been erasing me from his future." Michael's voice remained level, despite the rage coursing through him. "What I don't understand is why you went along with it." "Because I love him." The simplicity of her response was more devastating than any elaborate justification. "And because he loves you more than you realize. He has an interesting way of showing it." Elena leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Your father is terrified of you, Michael. Terrified that he's failed you as a parent. Terrified that he's destroyed any chance of a real relationship through years of emotional distance. He talks about you with such pain, such regret." "Regret about what?" "About not knowing how to reach you. About building walls between you that he doesn't know how to tear down. About being so focused on providing for your future that he forgot to be present in your childhood." The words hit Michael like physical blows. "So his solution is to give my inheritance to his girlfriend. His solution is to give the company to someone who shares his vision for what it could become. Richard doesn't see Coleman Industries as just a business. He sees it as a platform for cultural transformation, for creating something meaningful beyond profit." Elena's voice grew passionate. "You've never shown interest in that vision, Michael. You see the company as a birthright, not a calling. And you do? I see it as an opportunity to build something beautiful, to create spaces where art and commerce intersect, where development serves communities instead of displacing them. Richard and I have spent hours talking about converting some of your properties into cultural centers, about using the company's resources to support emerging artists and preserve historical architecture." Michael felt his world tilting again. Throughout their conversation, Elena had spoken about his father with an intimacy and understanding that Michael had never achieved. She knew Richard's dreams, his fears, his deepest aspirations, all the things Michael had never thought to ask about. "He promised me everything would go to you," Elena continued. "I fought him on the will. I told him his obligation was to his son, regardless of our relationship. But he said—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He said he'd rather leave his legacy to someone who loved what he'd built than to someone who saw it only as an inheritance." The words landed with devastating precision. Michael realized that his father hadn't just chosen Elena over him. Richard had looked at his son and found him wanting, had concluded that Michael lacked the passion and vision necessary to carry forward his life's work. Standing in that beautiful apartment, surrounded by evidence of his father's secret happiness, Michael finally understood the depth of his exclusion. Richard hadn't just hidden a relationship. He'd built an entire alternate life where he could be the man he'd never allowed himself to be with his son. The explosion came 3 days later, triggered by something as mundane as Richard's casual mention of a weekend trip to Carmel. Michael had been sitting at the breakfast table, mechanically eating cereal while watching his father scroll through emails on his phone, when the innocent comment about needing to get out of town for some fresh air ignited the rage that had been building. For weeks, with Elena, the question escaped before Michael could stop himself. Richard's fingers froze on his phone screen. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the street below. When Richard finally looked up, his face had assumed the carefully neutral expression Michael had learned to despise, the boardroom mask that transformed his father into a stranger. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Stop." Michael's voice cracked like a whip. "Just stop lying to me. I know about her. I know about the apartment, the will, everything." Richard set his phone down with deliberate calm, but Michael caught the slight tremor in his hands. "If you have something to say, Michael, then say it clearly." "I have plenty to say." Michael stood, his chair scraping against the tile floor with a sound like fingernails on glass. "Let's start with the fact that you've been living a double life for 3 years. Let's talk about how you've been planning to give my inheritance to your secret girlfriend. Let's discuss how you've turned me into a stranger in my own family. You are my son." "No!" The word erupted from Michael with volcanic force. "Don't you dare!" "Don't you dare stand there and pretend you care about me when you've already decided I'm not worthy of the life you've built, when you've already chosen her over me." Richard's composure finally cracked, revealing the steel beneath. "You want to know the truth, Michael? The truth is that you've never shown genuine interest in anything beyond your trust fund. You work at the company because it's expected, not because you believe in what we're building. You live in this house because it's comfortable, not because you want to be here with me. That's not true. When was the last time you asked me about my dreams? When was the last time you showed curiosity about anything in my life that didn't directly benefit you?" Richard's voice rose, years of suppressed frustration finally finding release. "Elena asked me about my childhood, about my fears, about what drives me. You asked me about quarterly projections and your stock options." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Michael felt his world tilting, every assumption about their relationship suddenly revealed as self-serving delusion. "So that justifies lying to me? Hiding the most important relationship in your life?" "I wasn't hiding it. I was protecting it. Protecting us both from this exact conversation. By writing me out of your will behind my back. By leaving my legacy to someone who actually values what I've spent my life creating." Richard's mask had completely dissolved now, revealing a man capable of startling cruelty. "You see Coleman Industries as your birthright. Elena sees it as an opportunity to build something meaningful. You see my death as your payday. She sees it as a tragedy." The words struck Michael with devastating precision. Every syllable confirmed his worst fears about how his father perceived him, as mercenary, shallow, unworthy of love or legacy. The breakfast table between them might as well have been an ocean. "You're right," Michael said, his voice dropping to a whisper more dangerous than shouting. "I do see your death as my payday, because that's the only way you've ever shown me love. Through money, through promises about the future, through inheritance. You never taught me how to love you any other way." Richard's face went pale. "Michael, no. You don't get to feel guilty now. You made your choice. You chose her." Michael moved toward the kitchen door, then turned back. "But here's something Elena doesn't know about your precious legacy, Dad. She doesn't know that you're a coward who spent 34 years emotionally starving his own son while pretending it was for his own good. She doesn't know that the man she loves is capable of that kind of cruelty. Where are you going? Away from you." Michael's voice carried a finality that made Richard flinch. "Away from this house, this family, this lie we've been living. Enjoy your weekend in Carmel. Enjoy your perfect relationship with your perfect woman. Just remember that when you're lying on your deathbed, she'll inherit your money, but I'll still be your son. And I'll remember every word you said to me this morning." Michael walked out, leaving Richard standing alone in the kitchen surrounded by the debris of their shattered relationship. The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows, and Richard could hear Michael's BMW roaring to life in the driveway. For the first time in years, Richard Coleman, master of boardrooms and builder of empires, felt completely powerless. The son he'd tried so hard to protect had just walked out of his life, and Richard wasn't sure he had the strength or wisdom to bring him back. The garage had always been Michael's sanctuary during childhood, a place where he could escape the suffocating perfection of the mansion's interior spaces. Now, at nearly midnight, He found himself there again, but this time the familiar smell of motor oil and stored memories offered no comfort. His hands shook as he moved through the organized chaos of his father's workshop, power tools arranged with military precision, gardening equipment that rarely saw use, boxes of Christmas decorations that chronicled decades of increasingly hollow celebrations. The overhead fluorescent light cast harsh shadows that seemed to dance with his fractured thoughts. Everything felt hyper-real, as if he were observing his own actions from outside his body. The weight of Richard's words from that morning played, on endless loop. You see my death as your payday. Elena sees it as a tragedy. You've never shown genuine interest in anything beyond your trust fund. Each accusation had been calculated to wound, and they had found their mark with surgical precision. But worse than the cruelty was the possibility that every word had been true. Michael tried to remember a single conversation with his father that hadn't eventually turned to business or money. A single moment when he'd expressed curiosity about Richard's inner life rather than external achievements. The memories came in fragments. Himself at 12, asking his father about his mother's favorite flowers, only to be told that dwelling on the past wasn't productive. Himself at 16, suggesting they take a vacation together, receiving a lecture about the importance of utilizing time efficiently. Himself at 25, attempting to discuss a book he'd read, watching his father's eyes glaze over with polite disinterest. But now he understood. Those moments hadn't been rejected because Richard was incapable of intimacy. They'd been rejected because Michael had been found wanting, judged as insufficient by the man whose approval he'd spent his entire life seeking. His fingers closed around the hammer's handle without conscious decision. It was a tool he'd seen. His father used countless times during Michael's childhood, back when Richard still maintained the pretense of being a hands-on parent. The weight felt substantial, purposeful, 2 pounds of steel and wood that could drive nails through the hardest surfaces. The house loomed above him, its windows glowing like eyes in the darkness. Somewhere inside, Richard was probably in his study, perhaps talking to Elena on the phone, sharing intimate details about their argument while portraying Michael as the ungrateful son who couldn't appreciate his father's wisdom. Michael's grip tightened on the hammer. The metal felt warm against his palm, as if it were absorbing the heat of his rage. He could picture Richard's face, that expression of disappointed authority that had haunted Michael's nightmares since childhood. The same look he'd worn while explaining why Michael wasn't worthy of his legacy, why Elena deserved what had always been promised to his son. The night air felt thick, oppressive, as if the sky itself were pressing down on him. Stars that should have provided perspective seemed instead to mock him, distant points of light in an infinite darkness that perfectly mirrored his sudden understanding of his place in his father's universe. 34 years of careful obedience, of molding himself into the son he thought Richard wanted, and it had all been meaningless. While he'd been performing the role of dutiful heir, Richard had been falling in love with someone else, finding in Elena the connection he'd never sought with his own child. The hammer's weight had become familiar now, natural in his grip. Michael moved toward the house, his footsteps silent on the dew-dampened grass. Above him, the mansion's windows glowed like a lighthouse, guiding him toward a confrontation that felt as inevitable as gravity. In his mind, the accusations continued to echo. You see my death as your payday. Soon, Michael thought with crystalline clarity, that assumption would finally be put to the test. The house breathed around Michael as he moved through its darkened corridors, every board and beam familiar from a lifetime of navigation. The grandfather. Clock in the foyer chimed twice, its brass pendulum catching fragments of moonlight that filtered through the stained glass windows his mother had chosen 30 years ago. He'd always loved that clock as a child, its reliable heartbeat marking time in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. Now its rhythm seemed to synchronize with his own pulse, both accelerating as he climbed the mahogany staircase toward his father's bedroom. The hammer hung loose in his right hand, its weight no longer foreign but natural, as if it had always been part of him. Richard's door stood slightly ajar, the way it had throughout Michael's childhood when nightmares would drive him seeking comfort that rarely came. Through the gap, Michael could see his father's sleeping form beneath Egyptian cotton sheets, His face relaxed in ways it never was during waking hours. At 62, Richard still possessed the strong jawline and silver hair that made him photograph well for business magazines, but sleep had erased the calculating intelligence from his features, leaving behind something almost vulnerable. For a moment, Michael hesitated. This was his father, the man who had taught him to ride a bicycle, who had sat beside his hospital bed when pneumonia nearly killed him at age 8, who had walked him through his first business presentation with patient encouragement. But those memories felt like artifacts from someone else's life, overshadowed by decades of emotional distance and the devastating revelations of recent weeks. Michael pushed the door wider, its hinges producing only the faintest whisper of sound. The bedroom smelled of his father's cologne and the faint mustiness that accumulated in rooms where windows were rarely opened. Family photographs lined the dresser, images of Michael's graduation, business awards ceremonies, charity galas where they'd stood side by side wearing matching tuxedos and hollow smiles. None of the photographs included Elena. That absence struck Michael as the final insult. Even in his most private space, Richard had maintained the fiction that his son was his primary relationship, his most important legacy. The deception was so complete, so carefully maintained, that it approached artistry. Richard stirred slightly, perhaps sensing another presence in the room, but didn't wake. His breathing remained deep and regular, the rhythm of someone who slept, without guilt or worry about the devastation he'd wrought in his child's life. Michael wondered if his father ever dreamed about Elena, if he whispered her name in his sleep the way he'd never whispered Michael's. The hammer felt heavier now, as if gravity itself were conspiring to pull it downward. Michael raised it slowly, his arm moving with mechanical precision despite the tremor that had overtaken his entire body. The weight shifted in his grip, the wooden handle slick with perspiration, and for an instant he considered setting it down, walking away, finding some other solution to the impossible equation of his life. But then Richard's phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text message that illuminated the screen for several seconds. Even from across the room, Michael could see Elena's name and the beginning of what appeared to be an endearment. The casual intimacy of that late-night communication, the evidence of ongoing connection while Michael lay sleepless in his own room, crystallized every betrayal into a moment of perfect clarity. The hammer descended with surprising speed, driven by gravity and 34 years of accumulated rage. The sound was nothing like Michael had expected, not the dramatic crack of splitting wood, but something wet and final, like a melon dropping on concrete. Richard's body jerked once, violently, then went completely still. Silence rushed in to fill the space where his father's breathing had been. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if the house itself were shocked by what had just occurred within its walls. Michael stood frozen, the hammer still raised, waiting for Richard to move again, to sit up and demand an explanation for this impossible violation. But Richard Coleman, builder of empires, keeper of secrets, father and stranger, would never move again. The silver hair that had always been perfectly styled was now matted with something dark that spread across the white pillowcase like spilled ink. His eyes remained closed, as if he'd simply slipped from sleep into something deeper and more permanent. Michael's hands began to shake uncontrollably. The hammer slipped from his grip, landing on the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. He stared at his father's still form, waiting for the relief or satisfaction he'd imagined would follow. This moment of ultimate confrontation. Instead, he felt only a crushing emptiness, the recognition that he'd destroyed the only relationship that had ever truly mattered to him, even if that relationship had been built on lies and disappointment. Richard was gone, taking with him any possibility of reconciliation, explanation, or the love Michael had spent his entire life seeking. Panic arrived in waves, each one more devastating than the last. Michael's knees buckled, sending him crashing to the floor beside his father's bed, where the reality of what he'd done finally penetrated the protective numbness that had carried him through the act itself. The metallic smell of blood mingled with his father's cologne, creating an olfactory signature that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. His hands moved without conscious direction, grabbing the hammer and stumbling toward the master bathroom. The marble surfaces that his mother had selected decades ago now reflected a stranger's face, pale, hollow-eyed, streaked with tears he didn't remember shedding. He scrubbed the hammer's head with hand towels that quickly turned crimson, then realized he was leaving traces of himself throughout the crime scene. Think. Think like Richard would think. Methodically. Strategically. The staged burglary took shape in his mind with terrifying clarity. Michael moved through the house like a man possessed, overturning furniture in the study, emptying jewelry boxes, creating the chaos that investigators would expect from a violent home invasion. He pocketed several pieces of his mother's jewelry, items he'd planned to inherit anyway, and scattered papers across Richard's desk to suggest someone had been searching for valuables. The front door's security system posed a problem until he remembered the kitchen window that had been sticking for months. Richard had planned to have it repaired but never followed through, a rare instance of his father's imperfection that now served Michael's desperate purposes. He forced the window wider, creating what appeared to be an entry point, then scattered dirt and leaves across the kitchen floor. But the blood was everywhere, more than he'd anticipated, seeping into the mattress, spattering the walls, creating evidence that no amount of cleaning could completely eliminate. Michael changed his clothes, stuffing the blood-stained garments into a garbage bag along with the towels he'd used. The hammer went into the same bag, wrapped in one of his father's old business shirts. His hands shook as he dialed 911, forcing his voice into the register of shock and grief that any son would display upon discovering his father's murdered body. The operator's calm questions felt surreal. Was he certain his father was dead? Had he touched anything? Was he in a safe location? Someone broke in, Michael heard himself saying. They killed him. Oh God, they killed my father. The lies flowed with disturbing ease, each fabrication building on the last until he almost believed his own story. He was Michael, Coleman, devoted son, arriving home from a late business dinner to find his father brutally murdered by unknown intruders. He was the victim here, the traumatized survivor whose world had been shattered by random violence. But even as he spoke, Michael could hear sirens approaching, their wail growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. The sound triggered a fresh wave of panic. Had someone heard the commotion? Had neighbors noticed his car leaving and returning? How long before investigators began questioning his story? Through the kitchen window, he could see lights coming on in surrounding houses. Mrs. Henderson from next door was peering through her curtains, probably wondering about the emergency vehicles converging on the Coleman mansion. She'd always been suspicious of Michael, he remembered. One of those neighborhood busybodies who noticed everything and forgot nothing. The police would interview her within hours. They'd want to know about any unusual sounds, any suspicious activity, any details that might contradict his carefully constructed narrative. Michael realized with growing horror that his improvised cover-up might not be enough to withstand professional scrutiny. The sirens were in the driveway now, their red and blue lights painting the mansion's facade in alternating colors of accusation. Michael took one last look around the kitchen, searching for any evidence he might have missed, then walked toward the front door to meet his fate. Detective Sarah Martinez had investigated over 200 homicides during her 15-year career with the LAPD, and experience had taught her to trust the small inconsistencies that most people overlooked. The Coleman murder scene contained dozens of them, each one whispering that something fundamental about Michael's story didn't align with the physical evidence. The supposed point of entry troubled her immediately. The kitchen window showed signs of forced opening, but the glass fragments and dirt patterns suggested manipulation from inside the house rather than external intrusion. No footprints led from the window to other parts of the house, and the scattered debris appeared too deliberately placed, the work of someone creating a scene rather than someone desperately searching for valuables. "Tell me again about your evening," Martinez said, studying Michael across the interview room table. 3 days had passed since Richard's murder, and Michael's grief performance had begun to show cracks around the edges. His hands trembled slightly, and he'd developed a nervous habit of touching his neck whenever questions grew too specific.